Welcome back to our study of the book of Daniel. In this lesson, we'll be looking at chapter 8, in which Daniel receives another vision rich in apocalyptic imagery. This vision came in the third year of Belshazzar, which would have been about the year 554 BC, 2 years after his dream of the four beasts that we read about in chapter 7. Now, although Daniel was still living in Babylon at this time, the vision strangely transports him to Susa, the capital of the up-and-coming Persian Empire. The genre of the vision is clearly apocalyptic, but the meaning of the imagery is explained within the narrative, which is unusual. This makes the vision a valuable reference for understanding the nature and function of the apocalyptic genre in Hebrew literature. And with the beginning of chapter 8 and continuing through the end of the book, the language of the original text reverts back to Hebrew, perhaps indicating that this material was part of Daniel's private memoirs. So let's begin reading in verse 1. In the third year of the reign of Belshazzar the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai canal. Then I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram, which had 2 horns, was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power. But he did as he pleased and magnified himself. While I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had the 2 horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him. And he struck the ram and shattered his 2 horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly. But as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns towards the 4 winds of heaven. Let's just stop right here and summarize what we've read before moving on. As the vision begins, Daniel sees a ram standing beside a canal in Susa called the Ulai Canal. It has 2 horns. One of them is longer than the other one, and the longer one is the last to arise. The ram is moving from the east towards the north, south, and west. And then suddenly Daniel sees a second beast, this one being a shaggy goat with 1 prominent horn protruding from between its eyes. The goat moves in the opposite direction from the ram, from west to east, going so fast that he doesn't even touch the ground. He charges the ram in a great rage, breaks his power, and tramples him to death. But at the height of his own power, the goat's great horn is broken off, and 4 other horns spring up in its place. Now, while all this action may be curiously fascinating, it seems to only be setting the stage for the main act, which is still to come. The most prominent image in the entire vision of chapter 8 is the small horn that we're about to read about. So let's continue reading in verse 8. Out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew up to the host of heaven, and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down. It even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host. And it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, "How long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply, while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled?" He said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored." So, this horn has its origins in one of the four horns which had branched off from the original prominent horn. It started out small, but it rapidly grew in power, advancing to the south, the east, and again what is called the beautiful land. As we keep reading, we see that as the little horn's power grew, it became increasingly ambitious and arrogant. Verse 10 says, "It grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down. It proclaimed itself to be as great as the commander of the host, taking away his daily sacrifices and desecrating his sanctuary." The arrogance of the small horn is summarized in the second part of verse 12. It will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. A phrase in the first part of verse 12 is crucial to a proper understanding of the message of this vision. "And on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice." Now, this comes right in the middle of the description of the atrocities committed by the small horn. The reason for these atrocities is said to be on account of transgression. Now, this raises an intriguing question. Whose transgression? Well, we'll come back to this question when we get to the interpretation of the vision. In verse 13, a heavenly being asks, "How long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply?" The reply is, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the holy place will be properly restored." This is another interesting statement that we'll give some time to when we get to the interpretation of the vision. But if we've got questions, it won't come as much of a surprise to us that after seeing this strange vision, Daniel had questions of his own. He was eager to know what it all meant. And we continue our reading at verse 15. "When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, standing before me was one who looked like a man. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of Ulai. And he called out and said, 'Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision.' So he came near to where I was standing. And when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, 'Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end.' Now while he was talking with me, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand upright. He said, 'Behold, I am going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. The ram which you saw with the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. The broken horn and the four horns that arose in its place represent four kingdoms which will arise from his nation, although not with his power." The interpreter of the dream is identified as Gabriel. Gabriel will appear again in chapter 9. In the New Testament, Gabriel is the angel who announced the impending births of John the Baptist and Jesus. And for reference there, you can check Luke chapter 1, verses 19 and 26. But Gabriel is not the only one present here. In verses 15 and 16, Daniel says that he saw someone who looked like a man, and that he heard the voice of a man. Now, this person is not named, but he obviously possesses great authority, for he is the one who commands Gabriel to give this man an understanding of the vision. And who but God would have the authority to issue commands to an angel? Well, when he speaks, Gabriel tells Daniel that the vision concerns the time of the end. In verse 19, Gabriel expands on this thought. He says, I am going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. And at the end of the interpretation, Gabriel instructs Daniel to keep the vision and its interpretation secret, because it pertains to many days in the future. Upon reading the interpretation of the vision, we'll see that it is concerned with the two empires that immediately followed Babylon in history. The time of the end, referred to in this context then, must be the period of time after the end of the Babylonian Empire. And with that in mind, Gabriel proceeds to interpret for Daniel the significance of the ram and the goat in his vision. We learn in verse 20 that the ram represents the Medo-Persian kingdom. During Daniel's time, Media had been a world power for centuries, while Persia was a newcomer to the scene of international heavyweights. But Persia was clearly the senior partner in this dual empire. And that's why in the vision, the horn of the ram, which grew later, also grew longer. The ram's movement from the east towards the north, south, and west parallels the directions of the Medo-Persian conquests and expansion into Babylon, Asia Minor, and Egypt. Verse 21 tells us that the goat represents the kingdom of Greece. The prominent horn represents Alexander III of Macedon, better known as Alexander the Great, the first Greek monarch of any historical importance. The movement of the goat from west to east without touching the ground symbolizes the incredibly rapid expansion of Alexander's empire, which he extended from the Greek homeland to the border of India during a span of only 11 years, from 334 to 323 BC. As the goat charged the ram, trampling it to death, so Alexander brought down the Persian Empire in 331 BC. Verse 22 tells us that the four lesser horns that arose in the place of the broken prominent horn represented four kingdoms that would branch off from the kingdom of the prominent horn. And just so, Alexander died in Babylon in 323 at the age of 33, shortly after pushing his eastern frontier to the Indus River. The four lesser horns correspond to Alexander's four generals, who divided his conquests between themselves after his death. Two of these post-Alexandrian Greek empires would figure prominently in the future history of the Jews. First was the Ptolemaic Empire, founded by General Ptolemy with its capital in Alexandria, Egypt. And second was the Seleucid Empire, founded by General Seleucus with its capital in Antioch of Syria. Judea was located right between these two centers of power and would be passed back and forth between them like a football for 150 years. We'll learn more about that in chapters 11 and 12. During all this time, the powerful influence of Hellenism, the culture and philosophy of Greece, would transform and degrade the character of the Jewish nation. Well, verses 23 to 25 interpret the small horn of verses 9 to 14 that arose out of one of the four earlier horns. We pick up our reading in verse 23. In the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue. His power will be mighty, but not by his own power, and he will destroy to an extraordinary degree, and prosper and perform his will. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people, and through his shrewdness he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence. And he will magnify himself in his heart, and he will destroy many while they are at ease. He will even oppose the prince of princes, but he will be broken without human agency. It is the nature and activity of this small horn that is really the subject of the entire vision. And his story is curiously recorded in poetic meter rather than in prose. In actual history, this horn arose from within the Seleucid Empire, and his name was Antiochus IV, surnamed Epiphanes, who reigned from 176 to 164 BC. Antiochus was an absolutely diabolical man, insolent and skilled in intrigue. He was determined to conquer the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt, and initially he was quite successful. Gabriel says, and he will destroy to an extraordinary degree, and prosper and perform his will. But war between Syria and Egypt could not help but have a deleterious effect on Judea. Geographically, Judea was a perfect buffer between the two empires. The beautiful land of verse 9, which would be absorbed by the small horn, is a reference to Judea. And the holy people of verse 24, many of whom would be destroyed by the king of verse 23, are the Jews. Although the Jews were under Seleucid control during Antiochus's time, they had earlier been subject to the Ptolemaic Empire for about 100 years. And there was a great deal of nostalgia and sympathy among the Jews for the Ptolemies, under whose rule they had generally been more prosperous and respected than they were under the Seleucids, and especially under Antiochus IV. Antiochus was fully aware of his unpopularity among the Jews, and to help ensure that there would be no insurrection among them during his Egyptian wars, he installed his own hand-picked men in the office of the high priest. Because in addition to being spiritual leaders, the high priests had become the de facto political rulers of the Jews during the post-exilic period. And having a loyal ally in that office would be seen as a distinct advantage for Antiochus. Antiochus had become a severe persecutor of the Jews, motivated by a zealous determination to assimilate them into Greek culture. Under his influence, Jewish culture and religion became increasingly influenced by the culture of Hellenism. His hand-picked high priest, Jason, which by the way is a Greek name, erected a gymnasium almost in the shadow of the temple in Jerusalem. And Greek gymnasia were as notorious for licentiousness and immorality as for the athletic events that went on in them. And soon, many of the Jewish aristocratic class and the upper echelons of the priesthood had virtually forsaken the Mosaic covenant and the service of the temple for the allurements of the gymnasium and other elements of Greek culture. But not all Jews were enthralled by Hellenism, of course, and soon a schism developed between pro and anti-Hellenistic Jews. The pro-Hellenistic party enjoyed Antiochus's patronage and protection, but the antis were butchered by the thousands. And these factions would eventually crystallize into the opposing sects of the liberal Sadducees and the conservative Pharisees by the time of Jesus. Back in the original revelation of this vision, in verse 10, Gabriel says of the small horn, "It grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down." The host of heaven is a term most often used to refer either to the armies of angels in the service of God or to the stars in the sky. But it is also used of the people of God, who are promised to become as numerous as the stars in the sky. Reference the promise to Abraham in Genesis 12 and 3, and also in Genesis 15 and verse 5. And in Exodus 12:41, the Israelites who came out of the land of Egypt are also spoken of as the hosts of the Lord. Now, since the Greek tyrant can hardly exercise dominion over either the angels of heaven or the literal stars in the sky, it seems quite evident that the phrase, the host of heaven, and the stars in this text must refer to those Jewish believers who actively resisted Antiochus's efforts to Hellenize them. Then, in verse 11 of the original revelation of this vision, the small horn proclaimed itself to be as great as the commander of the host, taking away his daily sacrifices and desecrating his sanctuary. The commander of the host is, of course, God. Antiochus's self-chosen surname, Epiphanes, means the manifest God, although his enemies often called him Epimanes, which means madman. But Antiochus did, in fact, at least in his choice of a surname and his installation of his own chosen man as the Jewish high priest, exalt himself to the place of God. And he put an end to the daily sacrifices and desecrated the temple of God in Jerusalem. Here's how it happened. In 168 BC, Antiochus launched a second campaign against Egypt to complete his conquest of the Ptolemaic Empire. But before he reached Alexandria, he was confronted by a single elderly Roman ambassador to Egypt, who issued an ultimatum. He could either remove all his troops from Egypt immediately or consider himself at war with the rising power of the Roman Republic. And weighing his options, Antiochus decided to withdraw. Ancient historical sources describe this withdrawal as a great humiliation for Antiochus that unhinged him for a time, and he really did become something of a madman. On his inglorious return to Antioch, he turned aside to vent his wrath on the Jews, whom he suspected of complicity with the Ptolemies. And he issued a decree outlawing the Jewish religion. He made it a capital crime to circumcise children, to own or possess the sacred Jewish scriptures, and to observe the feasts and sacrifices. To prevent the offering of the daily sacrifices, he desecrated the temple in Jerusalem by sacrificing a pig to the Greek god Zeus on God's altar, and pouring the broth from the burned meat all over the sacred chambers of the temple. We will see in Daniel chapters 11 and 12 that the desecration of the temple by Antiochus was called the abomination of desolation. In later times, the Jews would regard Antiochus as the perpetrator of this great abomination. The viewpoint of this vision, however, is that the abomination was committed by the Jews themselves. They were not innocent victims. Now, how can we say that? Well, the monstrous character of Antiochus IV's reign is so prominent in this vision that it's easy to overlook the timing and the purpose of it, but it's important. Look at verse 23. When Gabriel says that this wicked king would arise in the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course. Remember, in the initial vision of the small horn, verse 12 reads, "And on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn, along with the regular sacrifice." And at that point we asked, whose transgression? Well, if, as verse 28 seems to make clear, Antiochus IV comes to power only as the transgressors have run their course, that is, their time of judgment has come at last, then the transgressor cannot be him. In this vision, it's not the arrogant horn who is considered to be the transgressor, but rather it is the Jewish people themselves. The small horn is only the catalyst of God's judgment. Notice what Gabriel says in verse 25. He will cause deceit to succeed by his influence. In historical fact, as we've seen, many of the Jewish leaders became enamored of the luxuries and extravagances of Hellenism and the favors and privileges that Antiochus bestowed on those who would collaborate with him. Bribery, intrigue, and assassination became common methods of personal advancement. The deceit that was caused to prosper was the deceit of the Jewish leaders. And again in verse 25, he will destroy many while they are at ease. The atrocities committed by Antiochus were really the fruit of the sins of the Jews, which had now run its full course. Antiochus Epiphanes, then, is portrayed in this vision as an instrument of God's righteous judgment against the sin of his own people. And the age-old pattern of the punishment of God's rebellious people at the hands of foreign nations, even more wicked than they, as prophesied, for example, in the book of Habakkuk, this continues even after the exile. In verse 24, Gabriel says that his power will be mighty, but not by his own power, and he will destroy to an extraordinary degree and prosper and perform his will. Antiochus Epiphanes was a tremendously powerful ruler, and he committed horrific atrocities against the people of God. But it was all with God's permission and through God's power. And just as was the case with Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and all the others, when God's purposes in Antiochus's evil reign had been accomplished, he was taken out of the way. In 167 BC, the desecration of the temple fomented a rebellion against Antiochus, beginning in the tiny village of Modin, west of Jerusalem. And there an aged priest named Mattathias killed a Seleucid official who was trying to enforce a royal order to offer sacrifices to Zeus. Now, although Mattathias died soon after this incident, the rebellion was continued by his sons, with the mantle of leadership falling to Judas, whose nickname was Maccabee, which means the hammer. And after 3 years of guerrilla warfare, Antiochus's forces had been driven completely out of Judea. The temple was cleansed and rededicated in December of 164 BC, on a day still memorialized by the Jews in the Feast of Hanukkah. And a period of virtual independence ensued, which lasted for about 100 years. The fate of the small horn is revealed in verse 25. He will even oppose the Prince of Princes, but he will be broken without human agency. Gabriel revealed that as a just penalty for having dared to oppose the Prince of Princes, Antiochus would be removed from the scene. And so he was. Antiochus was so stunned and humiliated by his incredible reversal of fortune in Judea that he literally went mad. He became Epimanes. About a year later, after making an unsuccessful attempt to pillage a place called Nineveh, a wealthy temple in Elamus, he died of a sudden malady at the age of about 50. And thus the prophecy, he will be broken without human agency, was fulfilled. And so the vision and its interpretation are complete. The vision of the evenings and mornings, which has been told, is true. But keep the vision secret, for it pertains to many days in the future. The reference to the vision of the evenings and mornings, however, brings us back to some unfinished business from verses 13 and 14. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, "How long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply, while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled?" He said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the holy place will be properly restored." This apparently precise period of time has been understood by interpreters in different ways, but the preponderance of evidence seems to favor a duration of the cessation of the sacrifice as 1,150 days, composed of 1,150 evenings and 1,150 mornings, thus a total of 2,300 evenings and mornings. The law of Moses required dozens of different kinds of sacrifice, but the regular sacrifice mentioned in verses 11 and 13 of our text here undoubtedly refers to the continual burnt offering commanded and described in Numbers 28 that was offered every evening and morning. The interval between the suspension of the regular sacrifices and the rededication of the temple would thus be 1,150 days, or 3 years and 70 days. The rededication of the temple by Judas Maccabeus happened by our calendar in December of 164 BC. Now, counting backwards 1,150 days before that would point to a beginning point for the cessation of the regular sacrifices in October of 167 BC. And this fits remarkably well with the known history of the Maccabean rebellion. And so the vision of the evenings and mornings, which has been told, is true. Then Gabriel commands Daniel to keep the vision secret, for it pertains to many days in the future. Apparently, this vision was not publicized among the Jews during Daniel's lifetime. If it had been, it probably would have been written in Aramaic, for most of the Jews no longer spoke Hebrew by the end of the exile. It was not intended to be a prophetic message of warning or a call to repentance, typical of the prophetic oracles of Isaiah or Jeremiah. Rather, the vision seems to have been intended to inspire faith and hope among future generations of Jews who would experience the humiliation and suffering that is foretold in this vision. Then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. Then I got up again and carried on the king's business, but I was astounded at the vision, and there was none to explain it. Daniel's visceral reaction to the vision is understandable, but his statement that there was no one to explain it is a little confusing. It couldn't have been that he didn't know what the vision meant. Gabriel had made that all too clear to him. Rather, it must have been that he found it unfathomable that the lessons of the soon-to-be extinct Babylonian exile could be so easily forgotten by future generations of Jews. It was enough to make any faithful man of God sick. Daniel's vision of the ram and the goat serves to illuminate the divine judgment of God at work through Antiochus's atrocities, and to generate an eager longing for the future blessings that would come with the appearance of the Messiah. In our next lesson, we will be looking at another vision that Daniel received, again from the angel Gabriel, some 7 years later. And in that vision, Daniel will be given another look into the future with a clearer focus on the actual coming of the Messiah.
You will reign forever. Let your glory fill the earth. You will reign forever.